Let's start with the breaking news this hour. We've been following all morning long. Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. He served in various positions under 3 presidents and redefined the office of the Vice President by taking on several policy issues during his time in the White House. His family released a statement saying, quote, "The former Vice President died due to complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease." It went on to say, quote, "Dick Cheney was a great and good man who taught his children and grandchildren to love our country and to live lives of courage, honor, love, kindness, and fly fishing." Former President George W. Bush, who Dick Cheney served under, just issued a statement reading in part, "Laura and I will remember Dick Cheney for the decent, honorable man he was." He goes on to say, "History will remember him as among the finest public servants of his generation, a patriot who brought integrity, high intelligence, and seriousness of purpose to every position he held." And just moments ago, the flags at the White House were lowered to half-staff. Let us begin our coverage with CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett, who joins us from Washington to talk about this. Major, let's talk about the legacy of the former vice president and how he essentially redefined the role. If you obviously go back to vice presidents beginning with John Adams, who absolutely hated being vice president because they thought it was so ineffectual, he redefined that and made it something of consequence.
Absolutely, Vlad. Dick Cheney, unlike many vice presidents, is not a footnote in American history. He's not a footnote in American presidential history. He was, without question, the most powerful vice president ever to hold that position. Now, the vice presidency and its role and its interactiveness with the presidency was redefined before Dick Cheney became vice president by Al Gore and Bill Clinton. Al Gore was a very vigorous vice president for Bill Clinton, but that vigor was enlarged dramatically by Vice President Cheney and by design. Remember, George W. Bush, after he secured the Republican nomination in 2000, asked Cheney to lead up the committee to find him a running mate. And Cheney came back famously with the conclusion, "It should be me," thinking that if he became vice president, he could be a genuine and permanent power broker within the Bush White House. Most of that initially was oriented toward domestic policy. But then 9/11 happened. I was with President George W. Bush in Sarasota, Florida, that morning of the 9/11 attacks, but Dick Cheney, the vice president, was in the White House. And he, while Bush was flying around the country trying to get back to Washington, D.C., was making all the crucial decisions. That was a crucible moment for Dick Cheney, and it created within him a kind of permanent presence within the White House to lead the war on terror, redefine what the legal limits were in terms of holding prisoners suspected of being aligned with terrorists, interrogating them, using very harsh, in the eyes of some, torturous techniques to try to get information from them. And Dick Cheney said all of those things were permissible because 9/11 was an atrocity committed against America without precedent, and new ideas and new legal theories had to be developed to protect America from a future 9/11 style attack. And Dick Cheney never turned his eyes away from that. That led him to push within the administration for the Iraq War and something else, something called the unitary executive. And if you want to summarize Dick Cheney's 2 legacy words, one is Iraq, the other unitary executive. Iraq became something of an albatross for the Bush administration, led Congress to change hands in 2006 when Democrats won back. And when Donald Trump sought the presidency in 2016, he ran against the Iraq War and Dick Cheney and those like him as warmongers. But as president, first time and certainly the second time, what has Donald Trump embraced from the Dick Cheney legacy more aggressively than almost anything else? The concept of a unitary executive, that the powers of the president are vast and uncheckable in most regards, either by Congress or by the courts. All of that is playing out now. So Dick Cheney lives with us in the presidency of Donald Trump, even though he did not endorse Donald Trump in 2024. As a matter of fact, he endorsed and voted for Kamala Harris, a huge split within the Republican Party. But the unitary executive idea, first articulated powerfully by Dick Cheney in the Bush White House, lives with us today.
One thing before I let you go, Major, and that is, if you would, just give us a little insight into how his theory of politics evolved. This is a man who maybe people forget that he was a congressman serving in Wyoming. He became he was a chief of staff to President Ford. He was Secretary of Defense. And all of those moments, all of those career milestones sort of helped to shape his worldview. Talk a little bit about that.
So in Congress, he was a Republican from Wyoming, and he rose within the Republican leadership strictly within a minority power complex. Republicans in the House wielded no power when Dick Cheney was ascending the Republican leadership. They were essentially taking, as was often said by Republicans at that time, the table scraps from the ruling Democrats and liking it. Then he became defense secretary. Why? Well, because the Senate rejected John Tower of Texas, because he was too much of a quote-unquote womanizer and drinker. If that had not happened and Dick Cheney had not become defense secretary, he probably would have remained in the House for a very long time. And that would have meant no Newt Gingrich, because Newt Gingrich took the role that Dick Cheney had in the Republican leadership. He then led the ascendancy of Republicans in 1994, and the Republican Revolution that we've come to know was set in motion by that one moment in history when the Senate rejected John Tower. Then George H.W. Bush chose Dick Cheney as defense secretary, and that position placed him well in line later to become vice president and do all the things that he did after 9/11. So that moment in history when the Senate rejected someone whose name has long since been forgotten, John Tower's defense secretary, set many, many things in motion that Dick Cheney rode to the apex or the near apex of power.
Major Garrett, as always, brilliant analysis, my friend. Thank you very much. You're going to have a very, very busy day. I appreciate you jumping on, because we're going to see you later tonight on The Takeout. We're going to have you are going to have special election coverage on The Takeout throughout the course of the evening. So thank you very much for jumping in on this late breaking news. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, let's continue the conversation and bring in former White House official Ashley Davis. She was the special assistant to former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge during the George W. Bush administration, and of course then worked alongside the late vice president. So Ashley, I wonder if Major just laid out sort of his political view and his political worldview. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of insight into Dick Cheney, the man. The statement from his family talked about a loving father, a loving grandfather, a great fly fisherman. Just give a little sense of who he was behind closed doors, behind the scenes, because I think the public had a very different perception of him, and it all seems very quaint right now, given the rise of President Donald Trump. But there were moments, I recall as a younger man, where people would talk about Dick Cheney as if he was Darth Vader.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on. And first of all, I want to have my condolences to Liz and Mary and obviously Lynn Cheney. I mean, the vice president to me was someone who inspired and mentored me throughout my years in the White House. But as Major said, I was actually with the vice president on 9/11 as he was with the president on 9/11. And we were in the West Wing. And he was the calming voice during that time, talking to the president, talking to FAA with Secretary Norm Mineta as we were calling down planes to make sure that we were clearing the airspace, telling the president that not to come back right now in regards to the threats at the White House. But there is one notion that I do want to clear up, because I was on the campaign as well and went through the VP world. Dick Cheney did not ask for the VP job. George W. Bush thought that he was the right person for the VP job, and I think that is very important. There is a lot of misconception. Listen, he was a very powerful vice president because President Bush did respect him so much. But at the end of the day, President Bush was a very strong president who made the decisions. So, but there were the talk all the time that Dick Cheney was this evil person. So my office, fortunately, in my early 20s was right beside his in the West Wing, and he was more of a grandfather figure to me than anything. Taught me things of how to conduct yourself, to keep your mouth shut when you need to read The Economist every week, which is what I do to this day. That was one of his biggest pieces of advice to me. But listen, over the last few years, when he's kind of split with the party, he's a constitutionalist. Obviously, he and Liz had their issues with President Trump, but at the end of the day, he is a conservative. He is very much hawkish. He believes in the American dream. He believes in America being the most powerful country in the world. But at the end of the day, this President Trump attacked his daughter one way or the other. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't matter, and he was supporting his daughter.
Yeah, as you point out, he did have some disparaging remarks to make about President Trump, and they did not agree on a lot of things, specifically when it comes to foreign policy. As you say, the former vice president believed in a robust American foreign policy, first against the Soviet Union and later against Islamic terrorism. You were employee number one, Ashley, at the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11. And I want you to talk a little bit about how Vice President Cheney, the kind of role that he had and his aspirations for this department and ultimately what it came to be responsible for.
Yeah, so sure, and no one remembers this, nor should they, but October 8th, 2021, so about roughly a month after 9/11, actually, Dick Cheney was the one who thought of the idea of having the White House Office of Homeland Security, which would be the counterpart to the NSC. And we've never had this before. And he was the one that actually reached out to Tom Ridge, who was my former boss way back in the day as governor, and convinced Governor Ridge to come and be the first White House Office of Homeland Security director. And then 3 years later, we created the department and he became the first secretary. Obviously, President Bush and Governor Ridge were very close over the years in regards to Governor Ridge being part of President Bush's father administration and work. But Dick Cheney was the one that had this vision after 9/11. And listen, everything's not great about the Department of Homeland Security. We combined 26 agencies, 180,000 plus employees, even more than that now. But we, knock on wood, have been safe since 9/11, and we did put something in place. That was the vision of Dick Cheney in place that has protected our country. So can't argue with that, can you?
No, you cannot. And finally, Ashley, I want to talk a little bit about his daughter, Liz Cheney, who so vociferously took on Donald Trump, not only during the election, but even before. You know, the strain of conservatism and the Republican, the GOP that Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney represented seems to be sort of gone now today. It's very much has been remade in the image of Donald Trump. Talk to us a little bit about, because Dick Cheney had been a Republican his entire life, and Liz Cheney as well. I want you to sort of give us a sense of how they viewed the Republican Party, and ultimately how Liz, certainly we know how she feels about it, but how he might have felt about how the Republican Party has morphed over the last decade or so.
Well, there's a few things. I mean, first of all, Liz is a friend and really respect her. But it was always funny when my Democrat friends would be like, we would vote for Liz Cheney as president. And I'm like, you realize Liz Cheney's like more conservative than anybody. She just was arguing or not supportive of President Trump, mainly over January 6th and the Constitution and what she believed in what happened that day. Otherwise, they probably agree on 99% of the same thing in regards to conservative politics. When you mentioned earlier about his foreign policy, I mean, if you see, yes, he was definitely a hawk. He wanted to make sure that we were engaged in other areas of the world to make sure that America was safe. If you look but he was also very, very conservative on China, which I think is important, and very hot, and made sure said that China actually was our biggest threat. And up until 2018, I think is the last time he said that. There are a lot of similarities in what President Trump believes in. I think the biggest, though, is let's not fight wars anymore. Let's bring back the homeland. But if you see what the president has done over the last 9 months, 10 months in regards to Israel, in regards to some of these other negotiations that he's been working on, obviously we still haven't been able to do Ukraine yet. It's not that far off, but I guess the difference would be troops on the ground. So I'm not a big believer. I'm a Republican. I'm a Bush Republican is what I'm considered, but I'm not a big believer that there's this huge break in regards to some of our policies. There's maybe just one or two that everyone likes to talk about.
Really, really fascinating insights. Ashley Davis, thank you very, very much for spending some time with us this morning, remembering the late Dick Cheney, an outsized influence certainly on American history, on American politics, and the office of the vice presidency. Thank you so much, Ashley. We appreciate it.